She didn't look like a woman who was losing everything. That was the first thing Silas Mercer noticed about Eleanor Whitlock. The way she stood in the doorway of that worn-down ranch house, with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, like the dust and the debt and the silence of the frontier hadn't managed to touch her yet. But Silas had been on the road long enough to recognize the look behind steady eyes. He'd seen it on men who were one bad season from walking away from everything they'd built. He just hadn't expected to see it on a woman who was about to offer him the strangest proposition of his life. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to show up looking for a day's work and walk away with a wife, stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The road into Cutter's Bluff wasn't much of a road. It was more of a suggestion. Two shallow ruts worn into pale Texas dirt by wagon wheels and stubbornness, cutting through brush and mesquite and a whole lot of nothing. Silas Mercer had followed it since before sunrise, his horse Amos plodding along with the resignation of an animal that had learned not to expect much at the end of any trail. He was 30 years old and owned the horse, a saddle with a cracked left stirrup and the clothes on his back. That was the complete inventory of Silas Mercer's life, and there were mornings, like this one, when the accounting of it sat heavier than he liked. He'd heard about the Whitlock Ranch from a man at a feed store in Abilene who said the widow out there was paying fair wages for good work. That was enough. Silas didn't need much more reason than fair wages to point himself somewhere. He'd spent the last 8 years drifting from one ranch to the next across West Texas, mending fences, moving cattle, doing the kind of backbreaking work that left no mark on the landscape and no name in anyone's memory. He was good at it. He just wasn't sure anymore what good at it was worth. The ranch appeared through the mesquite around mid-morning, a main house that had probably been handsome once, a barn that leaned slightly south as though the wind had been pushing on it for years, a scattering of outbuildings in various states of repair, and beyond all of it, open pasture rolling toward a line of low hills. There were cattle out there. Not many, but some. Enough to tell him the place wasn't finished yet. He rode up slow, the way you do when you're coming onto someone else's land and you want them to see you coming. He'd learned that lesson early. People in isolated places didn't like surprises. A woman came out of the barn before he reached the fence. She was somewhere in her late 20s, Silas guessed. Dark hair pulled back practical and plain, wearing a canvas work apron over a simple dress that had seen better days. She was wiping her hands on a rag as she walked, and she didn't stop walking until she reached the fence post and leaned against it, looking up at him with an expression that was somewhere between cautious and tired. "Help you?" she said. "Name's Silas Mercer. Heard you might be looking for ranch hands." She looked at him the way people looked at the sky before deciding whether to start a long job, measuring, unhurried. "Who told you that?" "Man named Garrett, feed store in Abilene." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Garrett talks too much." She looked past him at the road, then back at him. "I'm Eleanor Whitlock. Get down if you want water. Your horse looks thirsty." Silas dismounted. Amos was in fact thirsty. He led him to the trough near the fence while Eleanor watched, and for a few minutes there was nothing but the sound of the horse drinking and the wind moving through the dry grass. "I'm a good worker," Silas said. "Done everything? Fence repair, herd management, winter feeding, calving. I don't complain, and I don't quit." "I believe you," Eleanor said. "So you're hiring?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I'm not looking for a ranch hand, Mr. Mercer." He turned to look at her. She met his eyes without flinching. "I need a husband." The word landed in the space between them like a dropped tool, solid and unexpected and impossible to ignore. Silas stared at her. "Beg your pardon?" "A husband," she said again, same tone, like she was repeating the price of feed. "Not the romantic kind, the legal kind. I need a man's name on certain documents before the end of the month, or I'm going to lose this ranch to a bank that's decided a widowed woman can't be trusted to run it herself." She paused. "And possibly to a neighbor who's been waiting for me to fail since my husband died." Silas looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the house. He looked at the barn. He looked back at her. "I don't know you," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't know you either. That's actually part of why this could work." He should have gotten back on his horse. He knew that, even then. Any reasonable man would have touched the brim of his hat, said something polite, and pointed Amos back toward the road to Abilene. What Eleanor Whitlock was describing was not a job. It was a trap disguised as a solution, and Silas had spent enough time in other people's messes to recognize one building up in front of him. But she brought him coffee. Sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. She brought him coffee and a plate of biscuits and set them on the porch table like he was already expected. And then she sat down across from him and laid out the situation in the plainest language he'd ever heard a woman use about her own desperation. No softening, no performance, just the facts as they were. Her husband, Thomas Whitlock, had died 18 months ago. Horse accident. Clean and fast and completely unfair, the way the worst things usually were. He'd left her the ranch, the cattle, a reasonable amount of land, and a mortgage that the Cutter's Bluff Savings Bank was now reviewing with suspicion because the law in this part of Texas held that a woman managing property alone was a credit risk by definition. "They haven't called the loan yet," she said, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. "But they've sent 2 letters in the last month saying they're evaluating the situation. That's bank language for getting ready to pull the rug." "And the neighbor?" Something shifted in her face. Just a small tightening around the eyes, but Silas caught it. "Victor Ashcombe," she said. "He owns the Broken Spur Ranch, east of here. He and Thomas were never friendly. There's an old boundary dispute, a section of land along the eastern creek that both families claimed. Thomas never resolved it because he never had to. The creek runs through good grazing land. Ashcombe wants it. And now that your husband's gone, he thinks I'm easier to push," she said. She didn't sound bitter about it exactly, more like she'd moved past bitter into something harder and colder. "He's right that I'm alone. He's wrong about everything else." Silas drank his coffee. It was good, stronger than he expected, with no apology for it. "What would this arrangement look like?" he asked. Practically speaking, she'd clearly thought about this. The words came out organized, like she'd been rehearsing them in the barn for weeks. "You'd have a room in the house. You'd work the ranch. Real work. I'm not hiring you to sit on the porch. There's plenty that needs doing, and I can't do all of it alone. In exchange, your name on the mortgage documents gives the bank what they need to stop second-guessing me. Legally, we'd be married. Practically, we'd be 2 people trying to save a cattle operation from going under." "And after?" Silas said. "If it works? After we're stable, we can discuss what comes next. I'm not asking you to sign away your life. I'm asking you to buy me time." "And if it doesn't work?" She looked at him levelly. "Then we both walk away from a failed ranch instead of one of us watching it get stripped by a bank." He set down his coffee cup. Outside, Amos had moved from the trough and was standing in the shade of the fence post, his tail switching lazily at flies. "How do you know I'm not going to sign your documents and disappear?" Silas asked. "I don't," she said. "But you came here looking for honest work, and you haven't laughed at me yet. That tells me something." She paused. "Also, I'm a decent judge of people. Thomas always said I was better at it than him." "Your husband." "My husband," she agreed quietly. There was a moment of silence that wasn't uncomfortable so much as careful. Silas watched a hawk circle over the far pasture, riding a thermal up and up until it was just a dark speck against the white Texas sky. "One question," he said. "Go ahead." "The neighbor, Ashcombe. You said he thinks you're easier to push. Has he done anything yet, specifically?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation Silas heard something she hadn't said out loud yet. 3 weeks ago," she said carefully, "one of my fence lines on the eastern boundary was cut. I found it in the morning, 20 yards of wire pulled clean off the posts. Cattle get out? Some. I got them back." "You report it?" "To who?" "Sheriff Beaumont is a reasonable man, but he's also a man who plays cards with Victor Ashcombe every Friday night." She said it without accusation, just tired pragmatism. "I fixed the fence myself." Silas nodded slowly. He looked at the barn, at the line of fence posts visible from the porch, running straight and then disappearing into the scrub, at the way the afternoon light was hitting the pasture and turning the dry grass gold. I'll need to know everything, he said. The full mortgage situation, the boundary dispute, all of it. Eleanor went very still. Does that mean you're saying yes? It means I'm not saying no yet. He picked up his coffee cup again. Show me the ranch first. But she walked him over every inch of it that afternoon. He'd expected her to hand it off to a ranch hand or trail him at a distance and let him form his own impressions. Instead, she walked beside him, through the barn, along the fence lines, out to the eastern pasture where the grass grew thicker near the creek, back past the outbuildings to the equipment shed where 2 of the 3 fencing tools were held together with wire and optimism. She didn't perform. That was what Silas kept coming back to. Most people, when they wanted something from you, showed you the best version of what they had. Eleanor Whitlock showed him a water trough with a slow leak, a barn roof with 3 bad shingles, a section of back fence that was one good windstorm from going down. She pointed to each problem like she was showing him a map of a battle she was losing, matter-of-fact about the damage and clear about what it would take to fix it. How many head? Silas asked, watching the cattle graze on the far side of the creek. 63, she said, down from 90 when Thomas died. I sold some to cover costs. The ones left are healthy. Who's been managing them? Me and a boy named Cal Hicks. He's 14 and serious about his work, but he can't be everywhere. She paused. I had 2 men before you arrived. They left in March when Ashcombe hired them away with better wages. He hired your men. Specifically mine, she said. Not other ranchers. Mine. Silas filed that. It said something about the kind of man Victor Ashcombe was. Not just ambitious, but strategic, patient, the kind of man who planned ahead. They were standing near the eastern fence when Eleanor pointed to a section of posts that were newer than the rest, the wood still lighter colored, recently set. That's where I had the cut wire, she said. Silas crouched and looked at the posts. The new wire was properly strung. She'd done clean work. You did this yourself? He asked. Cal helped with the heavy posts. He stood up and looked east toward where Ashcombe's land would begin somewhere beyond the scrub line. Where's the disputed section exactly? She pointed slightly south, where the creek bent and the grass grew thick on both sides of the water. Thomas always said the original survey line ran along the north bank of the creek, but the deed Ashcombe holds, or says he holds, puts the boundary 50 yards further into our property, across the water. That's good grazing. That's why he wants it, she said simply. Silas stood there a minute, looking at the creek, the land, the light dying slowly in the west. He was calculating things he didn't have words for yet. The scope of work, the nature of the threat, the kind of man it would take to hold all of this together. The surveyor who originally marked the boundaries, he said, is there a record of his work? In the deed documents at the house, yes. Thomas filed copies with the county clerk in Cutter's Bluff. She looked at him. Why? Because if there's an original survey on record, there might be a way to verify it, independently. He glanced at her. But that's later. You're thinking about this like it's already your problem, she said. I'm thinking about it like it's the problem you described, Silas said carefully. Whether it's mine depends on what you show me back at the house. The documents were kept in a wooden box under the desk in the small room off the main bedroom that Thomas Whitlock had used as an office. Eleanor set them on the kitchen table and stepped back, and Silas sat down and went through them the way he went through everything, slow and thorough and without hurrying. Mortgage papers, land deed, the county tax records from the past 5 years, 2 letters from the Cutter's Bluff Savings Bank, the most recent one dated 11 days ago. A handwritten summary Thomas had made of the boundary dispute, with a rough sketch of the creek and the fence lines. Eleanor sat across from him and didn't speak. She refilled his coffee once. Otherwise, she let him read. It took almost an hour. When he was done, Silas set the last page down and looked at the ceiling for a moment, turning it all over. The bank letters, he said. They mention a cosigner requirement. Yes. Not a husband specifically, a cosigner. Functionally the same thing in this county, she said. A woman asking another woman to cosign gets turned down. A woman asking an unmarried man who doesn't own property gets turned down. A married woman with a husband who can demonstrate stable employment, she stopped. They'd approve it. Thomas's boundary sketch, Silas said. He marked the original surveyor's name here. Elias Creed. Is that man still alive? She looked surprised that he'd found the name. I don't know. I never thought to look. Worth finding out. He tapped the papers. If Creed's original notes exist somewhere, if the survey stakes were ever officially recorded with the county, then Ashcombe's claim falls apart without a fight. You wouldn't need a lawyer or a sheriff, you just need the paperwork. You know about land surveys? I know about land, Silas said. I've been working it most of my life. You learn how things get stolen if you pay attention long enough. He paused. Can I ask you something direct? You've been direct this whole time, she said. Don't stop now. If this works, if we do this and the bank backs off and Ashcombe loses his angle, what does that mean for you? Just the ranch? Or something more? She thought about that honestly. He could tell. She didn't rush to answer it. It means I finish what Thomas started, she said finally. He wanted this to be something that lasted, a real operation, not just survival. I want that too. She looked at her hands on the table. He was a good man, and it wasn't fair what happened to him. The least I can do is not let his work disappear. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the documents spread between them. Then he looked at the window, at the last thin strip of orange light dying on the horizon. There's a problem with your south fence line, he said. The one near the equipment shed, 3 posts that are going to go in the next hard wind. I know, Eleanor said. I can fix those first thing tomorrow. She went very still. I'll need to know where the spare wire is, he added. Storage room off the barn, she said quietly. There's a full roll. He nodded. He gathered the papers carefully, stacked them, and slid them back toward her. I'll sleep in the barn tonight. We can talk to whoever does marriages in this town in the morning, if that's still what you want. Eleanor Whitlock looked at him across the kitchen table, and for the first time since he'd ridden up that afternoon, some of the iron in her face softened, just slightly, just at the edges, like something that had been braced for impact finally letting out a breath. The barn's clean, she said. There's a cot in the tack room. That'll do, Silas said. He stood, pushed his chair back, and put his hat on. At the door he paused. Mrs. Whitlock. Eleanor, she corrected. Eleanor. He opened the door. Lock up tonight. He said it quiet, without explanation, and walked out into the dark. She stood at the window and watched him cross to the barn, his shape disappearing into the shadows, and then she turned and locked the door. Not because she was afraid, but because something in the way he'd said it made her trust that it mattered. Outside, somewhere in the eastern dark past the fence line and the creek, the land that Victor Ashcombe wanted sat quiet and still under a sky full of stars. And somewhere in Cutter's Bluff, in a house with a well-lit study and a glass of good whiskey, Victor Ashcombe was thinking about the Whitlock Ranch the way a man thinks about something he's already decided belongs to him. He didn't know yet that a drifting cowboy named Silas Mercer had just put his hat on a cot in Eleanor Whitlock's tack room. He would find out soon enough. They got married on a Tuesday. There was nothing ceremonial about it. Justice of the peace in Cutter's Bluff was a heavy-set man named Harold Fitch, who ran the ceremony out of the back room of his dry goods store, between a shipment of flour sacks and a broken rocking chair someone had left for repair. He read the words from a worn booklet. They said what needed to be said, and it was done in under 10 minutes. Eleanor signed her name first, neat and deliberate. Silas signed after, his handwriting rougher, slanting slightly left the way it always had since a schoolteacher in Laredo told him he was holding the pen wrong. Fitch shook Silas's hand and nodded at Eleanor, and that was the extent of the celebration. Walking back to the wagon, neither of them spoke for half a block. Then Eleanor said, "We should go to the bank this afternoon while we're already in town." "Agreed," Silas said, "and I need to stop at the feed store." "I'll handle the feed store. You go to the bank and get the paperwork started. I'll meet you there in 20 minutes. She glanced at him sideways. It was the first time he'd made a decision about her day without asking, and he caught himself a half second after saying it. "Unless you'd rather—" "No," she said. "That works." She paused a beat. 40-pound bags. The ones with the red stripe on the label, not the blue. "Red stripe," he said. "Got it." She turned toward the bank and he turned toward the feed store, and that was more or less the shape of the first week. Two people moving in the same direction from different angles, figuring out the distance between them as they went. The bank manager's name was Gerald Pruitt, and he was the kind of man who kept his desk very clean and his opinions well hidden behind professional language. When Silas walked into the bank that afternoon and sat down beside Eleanor in the two chairs across from Pruitt's desk, he watched the man's eyes move from Eleanor to him and back again, reassessing the situation without letting it show on his face. "Mr. Mercer," Pruitt said, consulting the marriage document Eleanor had placed on his desk. "And you've been working in the region how long?" 8 years, Silas said. "Ranching work, mostly in this part of Texas. And you're planning to remain at the Whitlock property?" "It's the Mercer property now," Silas said. He said it without heat, just flat and clear. "And yes," Pruitt made a small note, "the bank's concern has been the management capacity of the operation given—" He stopped, rephrased, "given the current staffing situation." "The staffing situation is being addressed," Silas said. "I've already identified 3 fence sections that need immediate repair. We're evaluating the herd and expecting to add cattle before fall. The operation is functioning. The last 2 quarterly payments were made," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, both of them, on time. "Yes," Pruitt said. He looked at the document again. He looked at Silas. Something in whatever he saw there made him set the paper down and fold his hands on top of it. "I think we can extend a 30-day review period before any action on the loan terms. If the operation continues as represented, I don't anticipate further complications." Eleanor nodded. She didn't thank him, Silas noticed. She just nodded, like she'd expected nothing less and had never doubted the outcome. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. Outside on the boardwalk, she let out a slow breath through her nose. 30 days? She said. "It's enough," Silas said. "We just have to show him something worth seeing in 30 days. She looked at him. "Can we?" "Depends on how early you get up in the morning." "I've been up before sunrise since Thomas died." "Then we're fine," he said. The days started falling into a rhythm that surprised him by how quickly it felt normal. Silas was up before light, the way he'd been his whole working life. He'd have coffee going before Eleanor came down, and she never commented on it, just poured her cup and took it to the window and looked out at the dark while the ranch woke up around them. Cal Hicks would arrive sometime around sunup, a serious-faced boy with big hands and a habit of not speaking unless he had something worth saying, a quality Silas respected immediately. The 3 of them worked through the day in a rotation that Silas organized in his head and explained out loud only as needed: fences, cattle, equipment, pasture rotation. The south fence was repaired by end of the second day. 2 of the barn's structural supports got reinforced by the end of the first week. Silas located the source of the water trough leak, a hairline crack in the concrete seal at the base, and packed it with a mixture he'd learned from an old-timer in Uvalde that held better than anything you could buy at a hardware store. Eleanor watched him work the way she watched most things, at a slight remove, taking it in without commentary. He didn't need her approval, and she seemed to understand that. But one evening, passing by the barn while he was reinforcing the latch mechanism on the main door, she stopped and looked at what he'd done and said, "Thomas tried to fix that twice. It never held." "The hinge was the problem," Silas said, not looking up from what he was doing. "He was fixing the latch. Needed to replace the hinge." A pause. "How'd you know?" "You can see where the door was swinging wrong, the wear pattern on the floor." She was quiet for a moment. "You notice a lot of things." "It's useful," he said simply. That was the beginning of her trusting him, though neither of them would have called it that yet. Trust was a word that implied you'd made a decision about someone. What was happening between them was quieter than a decision, more like water finding the path of least resistance, natural and unhurried. He found the first piece of evidence on a Thursday, 3 weeks in. He'd been working the eastern pasture, checking fence posts, when he came across a section where the ground had been disturbed. Not recently. This was months old, the soil settled back in and grass starting to come up through it. But the pattern was deliberate. Someone had pulled several of the original wooden boundary markers. the kind of rough-hewn posts that had been in the ground since the original survey, and replaced them with newer ones set 2 feet further west. 2 feet. Enough to move a survey line without it being obvious from a distance. Enough to shift the creekside grazing land across the boundary if you measured from the new markers instead of the original ones. Silas crouched in the grass for a long time, looking at the posts, at the slight depression in the dirt where the old ones had been pulled. Then he stood and walked the fence line both ways, measuring distances in his head, comparing them to the sketch Thomas Whitlock had drawn in his notes. He didn't say anything to Eleanor that evening. He went to the house, ate dinner, contributed 3 sentences to the conversation, and went to his room, which was no longer the tack room but the small bedroom at the end of the hall that Eleanor had cleared out for him without making an occasion of it. He lay on his back on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Victor Ashcombe. The moved markers were patient work, the kind of thing you did a long time in advance before anyone was paying attention, so that when you finally pushed the claim, the evidence had already aged into something that looked established. Ashcombe had been planning this since before Thomas died, maybe. Or he'd moved fast after, knowing a grieving widow was unlikely to be walking fence lines with a measuring tape. The problem was that moved markers by themselves were hard to prove. Ashcombe could claim they'd always been there. He could claim Thomas had set them wrong. Without the original survey documentation, it was one man's word against another. And Ashcombe had the kind of word that carried more weight in Cutter's Bluff than a widow's. What Silas needed was the original surveyor, Elias Creed. The name Thomas Whitlock had written in his boundary notes, followed by a date 12 years prior. The next morning, before breakfast, Silas asked Eleanor, "Do you know anyone at the county clerk's office in Cutter's Bluff?" She looked at him over her coffee. "Mabel Pruitt, Gerald Pruitt's wife. She works there Thursday mornings." A pause. "Why?" He told her what he'd found. Eleanor set her cup down carefully. Her face didn't change much, but her jaw tightened. "He moved the markers," she said, "months ago, maybe longer. And if his boundary claim is based on those markers, it falls apart if we can establish where the originals were set, which means we need the original survey record. And if Elias Creed is still alive, we need his testimony." He looked at her. "I want to take a day and go to the county office. Look through the records myself. I should come with you." "You should stay here," he said. "I don't want the ranch left without someone who knows it, and I don't want Ashcombe's people seeing us both gone at the same time." She looked at him sharply. "You think he's watching us?" "I think a man who moves boundary markers at night doesn't stop paying attention after that," Silas said. The look on Eleanor's face was complicated, the kind of look that comes when you've been telling yourself you're not as surrounded as you feel, and someone says the thing out loud that confirms the feeling. She picked her coffee back up. Her hand was steady. "Mabel is usually there until noon," she said. "Tell her you're Thomas Whitlock's." She stopped. "Tell her you're looking for survey records on the property. She'll help you." "Will she say anything to her husband?" "Probably. But Gerald Pruitt is more useful to us nervous than comfortable." She looked out the window. "Let him wonder what we're doing." Mesent. The county records office was a single room behind the courthouse with shelves from floor to ceiling and a filing system that Mabel Pruitt maintained with the devotion of a woman who genuinely loved order. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman who said very little but found the survey file for the Whitlock property in under 4 minutes. Elias Creed's original survey, dated 14 years ago, not 12. Thomas had remembered wrong. Complete with hand-drawn boundary lines, compass readings, and the location of every marker set along the property's edges, reference to fixed natural landmarks. The bend in the creek, a particular granite outcropping, the junction of 2 dry washes. Silas spread it on the table Mabel provided and went over it line by line, comparing it in his head to what he'd walked on the eastern fence line. The markers Ashcombe had moved were referenced in the original survey to the south bank of the creek at the first bend, not 50 yards past it, not across the water, exactly where Eleanor had said they should be. "Is there a way to find out if Elias Creed is still alive?" Silas asked Mabel. "He retired to Gainesville," she said, without looking up from her own work. His nephew runs a hardware business there. They share the same last name. A pause. I'd heard he was still alive as of last spring, 70-something, and difficult from what I understand. Difficult how? The kind of man who doesn't like being told he doesn't remember things correctly. She glanced at him. You'll need to be careful how you approach him. I'm good with difficult men, Silas said. Mabel looked at him for a moment. I expect Eleanor Whitlock is lucky you showed up, she said, and then went back to her filing like she hadn't said it. Silas had a copy made of the relevant survey pages. He rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon with the papers folded inside his jacket, and he found Eleanor replacing a broken tool handle in the equipment shed, Cal working nearby on a section of rusted chain. She looked up when he walked in. He handed her the papers without preamble. She unfolded them. She looked at the survey lines, at the marker locations, at the date and the surveyor's signature at the bottom. Something worked across her face that she didn't have a word for and didn't try to put one to. He's in Gainesville, Silas said. Still alive. I'm going to write him a letter first and explain the situation. If he's willing to come out or provide a sworn statement, we have what we need. And if he's not willing, then we hire an independent surveyor to walk the original coordinates and document what's actually out there now versus what Creed recorded. Either way, the original survey is on record. Ashcombe can't make that disappear. Eleanor folded the papers again carefully. You went in there and found all this in one morning. The records were well kept, Silas said. Don't do that, she said. He looked at her. Don't credit the records. You went looking for the right thing, and you knew what you were looking for. She held the papers out to him. Keep these with the others at the house. They're safer with you. He took them. Their fingers didn't touch, but it was a near thing. The town hadn't been quiet about the marriage. Cutter's Bluff was the size of a place where everyone knew everyone's business, and most people had opinions about it. The news that Eleanor Whitlock had married a drifting ranch hand 3 weeks after he'd shown up on her property had made the rounds in about 48 hours, and the commentary ranged from openly skeptical to something uglier that Silas caught the edge of when he went to the hardware store for supplies, and two men in the corner stopped talking when he walked in. He bought his supplies and didn't acknowledge them, but Eleanor felt it more directly. A woman at the dry goods store who'd been friendly with her since Thomas's funeral gave her a look that was somehow both pitying and judgmental at the same time, and said, You must have been desperate, dear, in the tone of someone who thought they were being kind. Eleanor came home from that trip to town quiet, in a way that was different from her usual quiet. She worked through the rest of the afternoon without speaking, and when Silas came in for dinner, she'd made something more complicated than usual, a beef stew that required more effort than the day called for, and he understood that she needed the occupation. He sat down and ate, and for a while said nothing. Then he said, What did someone say to you? Nothing that matters, Eleanor said. Okay, he said. She looked up, apparently expecting him to push it. He didn't. He helped himself to more stew. After a moment, she said, People think I was foolish, or desperate, or both. People think what they see, Silas said. They haven't seen anything yet. She looked at him across the table. You're not bothered by it? What people are saying about you? He thought about that honestly before answering. I've been a drifter for 8 years. People in every town I worked in had an idea about what that meant. I got used to being what someone had already decided I was before I opened my mouth. He set his fork down. What bothers me is when they're right. They're not right this time. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Cal told me today that 2 of the boys from the Ashcombe Ranch had been riding along our eastern fence line in the mornings. Just riding, not crossing, just looking. I know, Silas said. I've seen them. You didn't mention it. I was waiting to see if they'd do anything or if it was just a show. He looked at her directly. What do you think it is? She considered. A show. Ashcombe letting us know he hasn't forgotten, that he's still watching. That's what I think too, Silas said, which means we watch back and we don't blink. Something in Eleanor's expression shifted, something that was almost like relief, though she would have been annoyed if anyone called it that. She picked up her fork again. The red stripe feed worked better than the blue, she said. You were right about that. The blue has more filler, Silas said. Not worth the extra money. Thomas always bought the blue, she said, not defending it, just noting it. Thomas didn't know, Silas said, without judgment. She almost smiled. It was brief and restrained, but it was there. No, she said. I suppose he didn't. The letter to Elias Creed went out on a Friday. Silas wrote it plain and honest, who he was, what property he was writing about, what had been found regarding the boundary markers, and what Creed's original survey showed. He didn't threaten or flatter. He just stated the facts and asked if Creed would be willing to provide a statement and included enough detail about the specific markers and coordinates from the original survey to prove he'd actually read the document and wasn't wasting the old man's time. He sealed it and handed it to the postwriter and then went back to the ranch and fixed a gate and repaired 2 sections of fence and helped Cal move the herd to the north pasture to let the eastern grass rest for 2 weeks. And when he finally came in at dusk, his hands were cut from the wire in 2 places and his back ached in the specific way it always did when he'd been lifting fence posts. Eleanor looked at his hands when he came into the kitchen. There's clean cloth in the drawer by the sink, she said. I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine, she said, pulling the drawer open herself and setting the cloth on the counter. He washed his hands and wrapped the cuts and sat at the kitchen table while she put dinner together, and there was something about the particular quiet of that evening. The light coming in low through the kitchen window, the smell of whatever was on the stove, the sound of Cal's horse leaving down the road outside. That felt different from the evenings before it, less like a business arrangement and more like something that didn't have a clean name yet. He didn't examine it too closely. There was work tomorrow, and the day after that, and the letter to Creed was out there moving toward Gainesville, and they had 20-something days left on the bank's review period, and Victor Ashcombe's men were riding the fence line every morning like a slow, patient threat. There was enough to deal with. Whatever this other thing was could wait. But he noticed it. That much was true. He noticed it, and he thought, sitting there at Eleanor Whitlock's kitchen table with his hands wrapped in clean cloth, that the word home was one he'd stopped using a long time ago because it had stopped meaning anything specific. It had always just meant wherever he was currently sleeping. He was starting to wonder if that was still accurate. He didn't say any of that. He just sat there in the quiet kitchen in the last of the evening light and let it exist without a name. And outside, the Texas dark came down slow and heavy over the land, over the fixed fences and the healthy cattle and the eastern boundary with its tampered markers, over all of it, like a hand settling over something worth keeping. Elias Creed's reply came 11 days after Silas sent the letter. It was short. 4 sentences, written in the cramped handwriting of a man whose hands had been doing precise work for 50 years and hadn't entirely forgiven the aging process for slowing them down. He remembered the Whitlock survey. He still had his field notes. He didn't appreciate what Silas was implying about the markers, but he appreciated even less the idea that someone might be using his work to steal land from a widow. He would come to Cutter's Bluff in 3 weeks if travel arrangements could be made. Silas read the letter twice, folded it, and handed it to Eleanor without saying anything. He watched her face as she read it, the way the tension around her eyes loosened, just slightly, the way she exhaled through her nose in a way she probably didn't know she was doing. 3 weeks, she said. Long enough to get everything else in order, Silas said. I want an independent surveyor to walk the eastern line before Creed arrives, so we have 2 sets of documentation instead of 1. That costs money. I know. Do we have it? She was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a person doing arithmetic they don't want to do out loud. I can manage it, she said finally, if nothing else breaks before then. It was the kind of conditional that frontier life specialized in. Nothing else breaks. If the weather holds, if the cattle stay healthy, if nothing goes wrong that hadn't already been anticipated, nothing stayed obliging for long. The sabotage happened on a night with no moon. Silas woke to the sound of Amos moving restlessly in the barn, not the normal shifting of an animal repositioning in sleep, but the tight, repetitive movement of something that smelled trouble and couldn't get away from it. He was dressed and out the door in under 2 minutes, moving across the yard in the dark with the lantern unlit, because he didn't want to announce himself before he knew what he was walking toward. He smelled it before he saw it. Not fire, something chemical and sharp. Creosote, maybe, or a solvent of some kind. He moved along the side of the barn toward the eastern yard and nearly walked into the fence before he saw that the section closest to the gate had been pulled down. Not broken. Pulled, deliberately. The wire rolled back from the posts, and the posts themselves yanked out of the ground and dropped in the grass. He stood very still and listened. The night was silent except for the wind and Amos, and somewhere far out in the pasture, the low, anxious sound of cattle that weren't where they were supposed to be. He went back inside and woke Eleanor. She came downstairs without being told twice, pulled on her coat over her nightclothes, and followed him out. When she saw the fence, she stood there a moment looking at it with the lantern she'd brought, her face unreadable. "How many sections?" she asked. "I don't know yet. This is as far as I got." "I'll take the south side. You take the east." "Eleanor, I know this land better than you do in the dark," she said, already moving. "Go." He went. It was bad. Not catastrophic, but close enough. 3 separate sections of the eastern fence had been taken down. The same eastern line that held the disputed boundary markers, which Silas noted without surprise. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to hit. Beyond the downed fence, out in the pasture that blurred into darkness, he could hear cattle moving in the wrong direction, drifting east toward the open ground and the creek, and the land that Ashcombe claimed was his. By the time Silas had walked the full perimeter of the damage, Eleanor had come around from the south side and met him near the creek bed. "South fence is clean," she said. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it. "How many head do you think went through?" "Hard to say. At least 20, maybe more." She looked out toward the dark pasture. Her jaw was set in the way it got when she was deciding something. "We can't leave them out there till morning. If Ashcombe's men find cattle on his land before we do, he'll claim they were grazing his property unlawfully." "I know. And with the boundary already in dispute—" "I know, Eleanor." He was already calculating. "Wake Cal. Send someone for him. Cal lives 4 miles out. Then ride yourself. I'll start pushing whatever I can find back toward the north pasture. We need the light from the lanterns, and we need another rider." He paused. "Can you do 4 miles in the dark?" She looked at him like that was not a serious question. "I've done it in worse." She was gone before he could say anything else, back toward the barn, moving fast and quiet. He heard her saddling her horse, heard the animal come out, heard the sound of hooves moving away at a canter into the darkness, and then he was alone with the broken fence and the restless night, and the knowledge that Victor Ashcombe had made his move. He didn't spend time being angry about it. There wasn't room for anger yet. He picked up the lantern and went looking for cattle. They worked through the rest of the night. Eleanor came back with Cal within the hour, the boy arriving half awake and fully committed, his serious face set against the dark. The 3 of them split the pasture by thirds and worked it systematically, pushing cattle back through the gaps in the fence, keeping them moving north. The ground near the creek was soft and cut up from the cattle that had already been through, and Silas's boots were soaked before midnight. He didn't stop. By the time the sky started going gray in the east, they'd recovered 41 head. That left somewhere between 15 and 22 unaccounted for, depending on the count, and every one of them was somewhere east of the downed fence on land that Victor Ashcombe would be riding at first light. They gathered at the fence gap as the sun came up, pale and cold, the sky the washed-out blue of an early Texas morning that hasn't decided yet what kind of day it wants to be. Eleanor's hair had come half out of its braid during the night's work. Cal had mud on his face from a stumble near the creek he hadn't mentioned to either of them. Silas's hands were cut again, worse than before, and one of his knuckles was bleeding from where a section of wire had caught it in the dark. Nobody looked good. Nobody remarked on it. "I need to get across that line before Ashcombe's men do," Silas said. "They'll have been watching at first light," Eleanor said. "They might already be out." "I know, but I'm going anyway." Cal said, "I'll come." "No," Silas said. "Stay here and start getting the fence back up. We need the south section closed before tonight. I'll deal with the cattle." "You're going onto Ashcombe's land alone," Eleanor said. "Onto disputed land," he corrected, "which is different. And yes." He looked at her. "If this turns into a conversation instead of a confrontation, one person is better than 2. 2 people look like a challenge. And if it turns into a confrontation, then 2 people still wouldn't be enough." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on a fence post. Keep the documentation from the county record somewhere you can get to it fast. The survey copies, all of it. She caught his arm as he turned toward the barn. He looked back at her. Her hand dropped almost immediately. She wasn't the kind of person who grabbed hold of people, and she looked briefly annoyed at herself for having done it. "Be careful," she said. Just that. "Always," he said, and wasn't sure that was true, but said it anyway. He found 15 of the missing cattle on the near side of the creek, still on ground that could reasonably be argued either way depending on which survey you believed. He found the other 8 on the far bank, past the water, on ground that Ashcomb's deed, the one with the falsified marker positions, would call his. Ashcomb's men found Silas at the same time Silas found the cattle. There were 2 of them riding out from the direction of the broken spur in the early light, and they pulled up on the far side of the creek and looked at him and the cattle with the satisfied expression of men who'd been expecting exactly this. The taller one Silas didn't recognize. The other one, thick through the chest, with a gray hat and a way of sitting his horse that suggested he was comfortable with his own authority. He'd seen before. He'd ridden the eastern fence line with the other Ashcombe men in the mornings. His name, Cal had mentioned once, was Dent. "Morning," Dent said. Not friendly, not hostile, just the word. "Morning," Silas said. "Those your cattle?" "They are." "They're on broken spur land," Dent said. "They're on disputed land," Silas said, "which isn't the same thing, and your boss knows it." He looked at the cattle. 8 animals standing in the creek grass, not going anywhere in particular, oblivious to the conversation happening around them. "I'm taking them back. Mr. Ashcombe might have something to say about that." "Mr. Ashcombe can say it to the county surveyor when he comes out next week," Silas said. "Until then, these are my cattle, and I'm moving them." He kept his voice flat. No heat, no challenge, just the statement of a man who had decided what was going to happen and wasn't interested in negotiating it. He moved his horse toward the cattle. Dent let him go. He felt the 2 of them watching his back all the way across the creek, but neither of them followed, and by the time he had the 8 animals moving through the shallow water and back onto the near bank, he heard them riding away toward the broken spur without a word. He got the cattle home. He came through the gap in the fence that Cal had already started closing from the south end, and Eleanor was there. And she looked at the 8 cattle and then at him and didn't ask how it had gone because she could read the answer in the way he was sitting his horse, tired and unhurt, and with all the cattle he'd gone after. "Dent was out there," he said, dismounting. "I expected someone would be." "They didn't push back." He tied Amos to the fence post. "But they will report it to Ashcombe, and Ashcombe will do something. Something like what he did last night." "Bigger," Silas said. "Last night was a warning. He got the cattle back without incident, so from his view the warning worked. The next move will be to press harder." He looked at the downed fence sections. "We need to move fast on the survey." They moved fast. Silas rode to Cutter's Bluff the next morning and engaged a land surveyor named Prudhomme, a taciturn man from San Antonio who came recommended by the county clerk's office as independent and accurate and unlikely to be influenced by local politics. Prudhomme came out 4 days later with his equipment and his assistant and walked the eastern boundary for 6 hours while Silas accompanied him and Eleanor managed the ranch. Prudhomme was a man of few words, which suited Silas fine. He took his measurements, made his notes, compared them to the survey record Silas had brought from the county office, and at the end of the day sat at the kitchen table and said 3 things. The original survey markers had been moved, the current marker positions were inconsistent with the geological features named in the original record, and his findings would be available as a sworn statement within 10 days. Eleanor thanked him. He nodded, accepted payment without ceremony, and left. After his wagon disappeared down the road, Eleanor and Silas stood on the porch in the cooling late afternoon and neither spoke for a moment. 2 surveyors, she said finally, Creed's original notes and Prudhomme's independent findings. Against markers that Ashcombe moved himself, Silas said. Yes. She turned to look at him. There was something in her face, not relief exactly, more like a soldier who'd been fighting for so long they'd forgotten what winning might feel like and were only starting to remember. We actually have him, she said. Not yet, Silas said. We have the documentation. We still have to survive whatever he does with the time between now and when we can use it. He said it because it was true, and because Eleanor was not a woman who needed false reassurance. She nodded once, taking it in. Then the first real cold came down from the north and made every calculation they'd made irrelevant. It started as a cold front, the normal Texas kind, dropping temperatures 30 degrees overnight and pushing gray clouds in from the north. Silas had seen those before. What he hadn't seen in 8 years of Texas ranching was what followed it. 3 days of building pressure, the sky going the particular green-yellow color that experienced cattlemen read as serious trouble. And then a storm that came down across the panhandle with the kind of indifferent ferocity that reminded everyone on the frontier how little their problems mattered to the weather. Snow in West Texas was not unheard of. Snow that lasted for days, that drifted against the barn walls and buried the fence lines and dropped temperatures to single digits for a week straight. That was rarer and meaner and tested everything a ranching operation was built on. The first night Silas spent mostly in the barn, keeping the horses from panicking and making sure the structure was holding against the wind. By the second morning, the drifts were up to his thighs in the east yard, and 3 sections of fence that had been fine were down again under the weight of accumulated ice. He fixed them in the cold with fingers that stopped cooperating around the second hour and didn't complain to Eleanor about it, because she was out in the same cold doing different work, and neither of them had the energy for complaints. The cattle were the main problem. They drifted in cold. That was the nature of them, moving away from the wind and bunching against whatever barrier they could find. And if the barrier wasn't there, they kept walking. Silas and Cal spent 2 full days doing nothing but moving cattle, keeping the herd together, breaking ice off the water troughs, and carrying feed out to animals too disoriented by the cold to come to the barn. Eleanor cooked. That was how she put her energy when she couldn't be outside. She kept the stove going and food ready for whenever they came in, which was sometimes midnight and sometimes 3 in the morning, and occasionally not until the gray light of the next day. Hot coffee, always. Whatever she could put together from what was in the cellar. She didn't make it a ceremony, didn't announce what she'd done. She just made sure there was something warm waiting every time they came through the door. Silas noticed it each time and said nothing each time, but it accumulated. The small, deliberate caring of it, the consistency. A woman who kept a pot of coffee hot through the worst nights was a woman paying attention to who was going to come through her door. On the 4th night, they lost 7 cattle. He found them in the morning, 3 frozen against the east fence where it had drifted, 4 more in a gully on the north side where they had apparently gotten separated in the dark and couldn't find their way out. He stood in the cold looking at them and felt the loss the way you feel things when you're too tired to have a proportionate reaction, dully, with a kind of distant recognition that this was bad without having the energy left to fully register how bad. He went back to the house and told Eleanor. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with her back to him. Her shoulders were tense. Then she turned around and her face was controlled in the way that took real effort. 7, she said. Yes, out of 63 that were healthy a month ago. Yes. She sat down at the table. Silas sat across from her. Outside the window, the snow was still coming down, lighter now, but still coming. Thomas lost 9 in a dry spell 2 years before he died, she said after a moment. He didn't sleep right for a month after. That's a reasonable response, Silas said. She looked at him. I keep thinking, if we hadn't had to spend so much time on the fence repairs after Ashcombe's men tore it down. Don't, Silas said. I'm just saying, Eleanor. He waited until she met his eyes. The storm took 7. We kept the other 45 through 3 days of the worst cold I've seen since Uvalde in 1879, with the fence half down and 1 14-year-old helping us. 7 is bad. It's not a failure. She was quiet. It feels like one. I know, he said. He didn't tell her it wasn't supposed to feel that way. He just said, I know, because that was the truth of it, and she didn't need anything dressed up. They sat there in the quiet kitchen while the snow came down and the fire in the stove ticked and shifted, and after a few minutes Eleanor got up and poured them both more coffee, and they sat a little longer before going back out to deal with what was left. By the end of the first week of the storm, Something had shifted in the relationship between the Mercer Ranch and the neighbors. It started with the Harlow family 2 miles north. They'd lost most of their hay supply under a collapsed storage roof, and their cattle were at risk of starving before they could get a resupply. Silas rode out on the 5th day with half of what he'd calculated they could spare from their own stores, tied behind Amos in 2 heavy bags. He didn't announce it or make an occasion of it. He left it with Pete Harlow's wife at their barn door and rode back before she could say much. Eleanor found out when Pete Harlow came by 2 days later to thank them. She looked at Silas after Pete left. "You gave away our hay." "Some of it." "Without asking me." He met her eyes. "Half of what we had room to spare. If I was wrong about the math, tell me." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "You weren't wrong about the math." "Okay then." "You still should have asked." "You're right," he said, without argument. "I should have." She looked at him for another moment, apparently not expecting the admission, and then nodded once. "Pete Harlow has 3 sons who'll be working ranches in this valley for the next 20 years, she said. "What you did today will be remembered longer than we'll be around to know about it." "I wasn't thinking about that," Silas said honestly. "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." The Harlow family talked, and the Claiborne Ranch to the south, which had its own storm damage to deal with, sent a man over on the 8th day with 2 strong fence posts and an offer of labor when things cleared. A woman named Agnes Birch, who ran a small cattle operation 3 miles west, stopped by with preserved food from her cellar, saying she'd heard they'd been struggling and she had more than she needed. None of these people had paid much attention to the Mercer Ranch before the storm. What they were paying attention to now was hard to name exactly. Not charity, not pity. Something more like recognition. 2 people who hadn't run, who hadn't given up, who'd even found something to give away in the middle of losing. Victor Ashcombe's name came up in 2 of those conversations, both times in the context of what his men had done before the storm. News traveled in the way it traveled in isolated communities, not quickly, but thoroughly. Pete Harlow had heard about the fence. Agnes Birch had heard about the cattle drive in the night. Neither of them said Ashcombe's name with anything like approval. Silas noted it and said nothing. But he noted it. On the 9th day, the snow stopped. It stopped the way it had started, without ceremony, without announcement, the clouds simply thinning and separating and the sky going from iron gray to a hard cold blue that meant the worst was done. Silas stood in the east yard in the stillness after the wind quit and looked out over the buried landscape. The fences mostly standing, the barn intact, the cattle alive and gathered in the near pasture, their breath making small clouds in the frozen air, and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite relief. It was closer to a bare acknowledgement. They were still here. The land was still theirs. The documentation was still in the box under Thomas Whitlock's old desk. Elias Creed was still coming. He turned back toward the house, and through the kitchen window he could see Eleanor moving, a shape in the warm light, doing something ordinary, existing in the space they'd been building together without quite meaning to, day by difficult day. The eastern fence line needed repair. The hay stores needed replenishing. Prudhomme's sworn statement was due in a week. There were 45 cattle that had survived the worst and needed looking after in the cold that followed it, which was sometimes nearly as dangerous as the storm itself. There was so much still to do. There was always so much still to do. Silas put his hat back on and went inside. Prudhomme's sworn statement arrived on a Wednesday, 8 days after the snow stopped. Silas read it at the kitchen table while Eleanor stood at the window with her coffee, watching Cal break ice off the water troughs in the yard. The document was 4 pages, precise and unsentimental. Exactly the kind of language that meant something in a county clerk's office or a courtroom. Prudhomme had documented the current marker positions, cross-referenced them against the geological landmarks named in the original Creed survey, and concluded in plain declarative sentences that the markers as currently placed were inconsistent with the original boundary record by a margin that could not be attributed to natural drift or measurement error. He used the word deliberate once. In a land surveyor's sworn statement, once was enough. Silas set it down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Well," Eleanor said without turning from the window. "It's good," he said. It's better than good. He's careful with his language, but the conclusion is clear. She turned then. Clear enough for the county clerk? Clear enough for a judge, if it comes to that. He tapped the document. Ashcombe's going to know we have this, or he's going to find out. Prudhomme's not going to lie about what work he's done if anyone asks him. Then we need Creed here before Ashcombe has time to move again, she said. Creed arrives Saturday, Silas said. I confirmed the date with the stage line yesterday. Eleanor set her coffee cup down. That's 3 days. 3 days, he agreed. We keep the fence up and the cattle in, and we don't do anything that gives Ashcombe a reason to act before Saturday. She looked at him with an expression that had a wry edge to it. You make that sound simple. Well, nothing about any of this is simple, Silas said. But 3 days is manageable. He said it with more certainty than he felt, because 3 days on a frontier ranch with a hostile neighbor and a surviving but depleted cattle operation felt like a long time. But there was no use in saying that, so he didn't. Bullshit. The 3 days passed, the way difficult waiting always passed, slowly at the front end and then in a rush at the finish. On the first day, Dent rode the eastern fence line again, this time with 3 men instead of 2. Silas watched them from the far side of the pasture without moving toward them or away from them, just watching. And after 20 minutes, they rode back toward the broken spur. He told Eleanor that night, and she nodded and said, He's counting us. And Silas thought she was probably right. On the second day, a man Silas didn't recognize came to the front gate on foot, which was unusual enough that Silas met him outside before he got to the porch. He was a thin man in a decent coat, carrying a leather satchel, and he introduced himself as an attorney named Colbert representing Victor Ashcombe's interests. Mr. Ashcombe would like to resolve the boundary matter without further conflict, Colbert said. He had the practiced ease of a man who delivered unwelcome proposals for a living and had gotten good at making them sound reasonable. He's prepared to offer a fair price for the Eastern Creek section, a cash settlement, clean and final. Silas looked at him. How much? Colbert named a figure. It was not a fair price. It was the kind of number that was large enough to sound generous to someone who was desperate and small enough to be insulting to someone who wasn't. No, Silas said. Mr. Mercer, the legal process in a boundary dispute of this nature can take years and considerable expense. We have an independent survey, and the original surveyor coming Saturday to provide a sworn statement, Silas said. If Ashcombe wants to resolve this, he can do it by acknowledging the original boundary. There's nothing to settle. He paused. You can tell him that. Colbert looked at him with the faint professional disappointment of a man who had hoped this would go differently. I'll relay your response, he said, and left. Eleanor had been standing in the doorway during the exchange. When Colbert's horse disappeared down the road, she said, He sent a lawyer. He's nervous, Silas said, or he's setting up the next move. Both can be true, Silas said. Let him be nervous. We don't have to do anything between now and Saturday except stay exactly where we are. She looked at the road where Colbert had gone. I don't like waiting. I know. He walked back toward the porch. Neither do I. On the third night, Silas didn't sleep much. He lay in the narrow bed and listened to the ranch sounds, the barn, the wind, the occasional movement of cattle in the near pasture, and ran through the documentation in his head for what was probably the 20th time. The original survey, Prudhomme's statement, Creed's field notes, which the man had mentioned in his letter and which, if they were as detailed as Silas hoped, would be the most valuable piece of the whole case. 3 independent threads pointing at the same conclusion. The boundary markers had been moved, the land belonged to the Whitlock Ranch, and the man who'd spent 2 years engineering a claim to it had built that claim on falsified ground. He was also thinking if he was honest with himself about Eleanor. Not strategically, not in terms of the arrangement or the ranch or what came next, just her. The specific way she'd stood in the barn door that first afternoon, measuring him without drama. The way she'd gone 4 miles in the dark on a moonless night without being asked twice. The way she'd said, "Be careful," before he crossed the creek to face Ashcombe's men, and how it had sounded less like a pleasantry and more like something she meant. He didn't know what to do with any of that yet. There was still too much in front of them that hadn't been resolved, but it was there, and he was aware of it the way you're aware of a change in weather. Not alarmed, not certain what it means, just knowing that something has shifted and the conditions are no longer what they were. He got up an hour before sunrise and made coffee and was outside checking fence before the sky went fully light. Elias Creed arrived on the Saturday stage from Gainesville looking like a man who had been difficult his entire life and saw no reason to stop. He was 73, according to the records, and looked every year of it, weathered and lean, with white hair cut short and eyes that moved over the landscape the way a surveyor's eyes always moved, measuring and cataloging without sentimentality. He shook Silas's hand at the stage office with the grip of a man who'd spent 50 years driving stakes into hard Texas ground, and acknowledged Eleanor with a nod that was more respectful than it might have seemed on the surface. He had his field notes with him in a canvas bag that had been repaired in 2 places and that he handled with the care most men reserved for things worth considerably more money. They took him out to the eastern boundary that same afternoon. Creed walked the fence line with his notes open in one hand, stopping at intervals, crouching at the base of certain posts, looking from the notes to the ground and back with an expression that Silas read as controlled displeasure building toward something more definitive. At the section where the markers had been moved, Creed stopped and stood for a long time without saying anything. He compared his field notes to the current marker positions. He looked at the creek bend. He looked at the granite outcropping 60 yards south that he'd used as a reference point 14 years ago. He looked at the distance between the current posts and where the original ones had been pulled. 2 feet, roughly, he said, more to himself than to either of them. About that, Silas said, closer to 26 inches at the southernmost point. Creed looked at him with those measuring eyes. You walked it. Several times. The old man looked back at the posts. I set these stakes myself, he said. I was 49 years old, and my knees were already giving me trouble, and I set these stakes in hard ground in August, and I referenced every single one of them to fixed natural landmarks that don't move. He tapped his notes. What's here now isn't what I set. We know, Eleanor said quietly. Somebody pulled my work out of the ground and moved it. He said it with the specific anger of a craftsman whose work has been disrespected. That's not a misreading. That's not a measurement error. That's deliberate. Yes, Silas said. That's what Prudhomme's statement says as well. Creed looked at him sharply. You got Prudhomme? You know him? By reputation. He's good. The old man straightened, tucking his notes back under his arm. I'll give you a sworn statement. Same conclusion. 2 of us saying the same thing from 2 independent sets of documentation is going to be very hard for anyone to argue with in front of a judge. We're hoping to avoid a judge, Silas said. If the documentation is clear enough, there may not be a dispute left to adjudicate. Creed looked out toward the broken spurland with an expression that was somewhere between contempt and pragmatism. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and counted on nobody looking closely enough. He paused. They counted wrong. Word moved through Cutter's Bluff, the way word always moved in a small county, faster than anyone intended and in more directions than anyone controlled. Silas hadn't set out to announce what he had, but Creed's arrival on the Saturday stage had been seen by enough people, and enough people knew who Elias Creed was, and when the original surveyor of a disputed property arrived in person to revisit his work, the implications weren't hard to follow. Gerald Pruitt at the bank heard about it from his wife on Saturday evening. The county clerk heard it from Mabel Pruitt on Monday morning. Sheriff Beaumont, who played cards with Victor Ashcombe on Friday nights, heard it from at least 3 different sources before the week was out. The conversation Silas had been expecting came on a Thursday. He was in the equipment shed working on a broken wagon axle when he heard a horse in the yard and came out to find Victor Ashcombe himself dismounting at the gate. He'd never seen the man in person before, only heard him described. Ashcombe was somewhere in his mid-50s, thick through the shoulders, with the well-maintained look of a man who was prosperous enough that he didn't have to do the hardest physical work anymore, but wanted people to think he still could. He wore a good coat and a hat that hadn't seen much weather. He looked like a man accustomed to arriving places and being deferred to. Eleanor was on the porch. She'd seen him coming down the road and had stayed exactly where she was. Ashcombe looked at Silas first, then at Eleanor, then back at Silas, as if he was deciding which one of them was in charge, and had reached an answer he wasn't entirely pleased with. Mercer, he said. Ashcombe, Silas said. Silas. He didn't move from where he was standing, which put about 15 feet between them, close enough for a conversation, far enough to be intentional. I understand you've brought Elias Creed out, Ashcombe said. The tone was measured, a man who'd been told the situation was worse than he'd hoped and was trying to determine exactly how much worse. We did, Silas said, and Prudhomme did an independent survey. He did. Ashcombe looked at the eastern fence line. He looked at the ranch, the repaired barn, the standing fences, the cattle visible in the near pasture. He was reassessing what he was looking at, and Silas could see the recalculation happening behind eyes that were doing their best not to show it. There's been a misunderstanding about the boundary, Ashcombe said carefully. Silas waited. The markers on my deed were moved, Silas said, at some point after Creed's original survey. Both Creed and Prudhomme have documented the discrepancy in sworn statements. Those statements are filed with the county clerk's office as of yesterday. He paused. There's no misunderstanding. Ashcombe's jaw worked. Those statements haven't been tested in court. No, Silas agreed. They haven't. Would you like them to be? The silence between them had weight in it. Ashcombe looked past Silas at Eleanor, who was still on the porch, still standing exactly where she'd been, watching without expression. Mrs. Mercer, Ashcombe said. He said her married name like it cost him something. You've been dealt a difficult hand since Thomas passed. Nobody disputes that. I was simply trying to— Don't, Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet and completely even. Don't tell me what you were trying to do. Something moved across Ashcombe's face. He looked back at Silas. The fence damage in October, Silas said. The cattle driven through the downed wire. The men riding the boundary line every morning to apply pressure. He listed them without accusation, just naming facts the way you name the parts of a thing you've already figured out. We have statements from Cal Hicks about what he observed. We have the dates and descriptions of each incident. You can't prove any of that connects to me, Ashcombe said, but the confidence in his voice had thinned. Maybe not in a way that satisfies a criminal charge, Silas said, but in a civil proceeding, alongside two independent surveys that establish your boundary claim is built on moved markers, it would tell a story that the county would understand. He looked at the man directly. You came here this morning to see how bad it was. Now you know. Ashcombe stood in the yard in the thin spring light, and the thing that was visible in him in that moment wasn't rage. It was the particular flatness of a man doing a final accounting and not liking the numbers. He'd been patient and strategic and had planned 3 moves ahead, and the widow had somehow ended up with a husband who'd dismantled every one of those moves before they could land. What do you want? Ashcombe said finally. We want the boundary acknowledged, Silas said. In writing, filed with the county. Your claim on the creek section dropped completely and permanently in a document that Colbert draws up and both parties sign. He paused. We're not asking for anything that was yours. We're asking you to stop claiming what was never yours to begin with. Another silence. A longer one. And the other matters, Ashcombe said carefully, meaning the fence, the cattle, the sabotage. If the boundary is settled correctly and completely, Silas said, we have no further business with you. It wasn't generosity. They both knew that. It was a clean exit offered to a man who no longer had any good options, because pursuing bad ones was expensive and uncertain, and the documentation against him was solid enough that a judge wouldn't need to take Ashcombe's word for anything. Ashcombe looked at Eleanor one more time. She looked back at him with nothing in her face that gave him anything to work with. No triumph, no anger, no mercy, just a woman who had outlasted him and was waiting for him to acknowledge it. He put his hat back on. Have Colbert draw the documents, he said. I'll sign them by the end of the month. He mounted his horse and rode out the gate without another word. Silas stood in the yard and watched him go until the dust settled. Then he turned and walked toward the porch, and when he got there, Eleanor was looking at the road where Ashcombe had disappeared, and she had one hand pressed flat against the porch railing in a way that suggested she needed the steadiness of it. He'll actually sign? She said. Not quite a question. He'll sign, Silas said. He's not the kind of man who burns down what he can't have. He'll cut his losses and move on to something he can still win. He looked at her hand on the railing. You all right? She took her hand off the railing deliberately. Yes. A pause. I keep waiting to feel more. What do you mean? I've been fighting this for so long. I expected it to feel different when he drove away just now. She looked at Silas with something honest in her face. It mostly just feels like I'm tired. That's allowed, Silas said. Is it? She almost smiled. I feel like I should be celebrating. You can do that later, he said, after you sleep. She made a sound that was as close to a laugh as he'd heard from her, brief and genuine and a little surprised at itself. You're very practical. One of us has to be, he said, and this time she did laugh, properly, and the sound of it in the quiet yard was something Silas didn't expect to want to hold on to as much as he did. Colbert sent the boundary documents 12 days later, not by the end of the month as promised, but close enough that Silas didn't remark on the delay. The documents were thorough and legally sound, which told him that whatever Ashcomb's faults, he was smart enough to know when a fight was over, and to end it cleanly, rather than leave openings that could be exploited later. Silas read them at the kitchen table, made 2 notes in the margin about specific language he wanted tightened, sent them back with a letter, and received the corrected version 4 days after that. The day they signed the boundary agreement and delivered it to the county clerk's office was a cold Tuesday in early March, the sky bright and hard, the way Texas skies got in late winter when the temperature was still low but the light had started to come back. Gerald Pruitt happened to be in the clerk's office when they filed, or maybe not happened to be, given the size of the town and the nature of small county information. He looked at the document, at both of them, and said something carefully neutral about being glad the matter had been settled. Eleanor thanked him with equal care. On the way out, she said under her breath to Silas, "He's going to be nicer to us at the bank now." "Probably," Silas said. "I'm not sure I want him to be nicer," she said. "I've gotten used to him being wary of me." "You can be suspicious of nice bankers," Silas said. "That's a healthy instinct." "You think so?" "I think wariness kept you going for a year and a half before I showed up," he said. "I wouldn't give it up entirely just because one problem is resolved." She considered that as they walked to the wagon. "You make it sound like another problem is already in line." "There's always another problem," he said. "That's not pessimism, that's ranching." She stopped at the wagon and looked at him with an expression that was complicated in a way she didn't try to conceal. "When you came here in October," she said, "you didn't know any of this was coming." "No? And you stayed anyway, through all of it." He met her eyes. "I said I don't quit." "You said that to get a job," she pointed out. "I say things I mean," he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment, the way she did when she was deciding whether to push further, and then she turned and climbed up to the wagon seat. He came around to the other side, and they drove back to the ranch in comfortable quiet, the county road stretching out ahead of them in the pale winter sun, the land rolling wide and still on both sides. The news traveled through the county the way the storm news had traveled, and the hay story before it. Not quickly, but completely. Pete Harlow came by to say he'd heard and was glad of it, and his handshake was the kind that meant more than the words. Agnes Birch sent a note. 3 other neighboring ranchers stopped in over the following 2 weeks with variations on the same message, and what Silas noticed was that the message was directed at both of them, not just at Eleanor as the property owner, not just at him as the man who'd handled the confrontation, but at both of them as a single unit, a partnership, which was something that hadn't existed before October and which had been built in the specific difficult way that made it actually mean something. Gerald Pruitt sent a letter the following week informing them that, based on the resolution of the boundary dispute and the ranch's demonstrated operational stability, the bank had no further concerns regarding the loan. The word that caught Silas's eye was demonstrated. Not given, demonstrated. Through a winter that would have broken a less determined operation and through a legal fight that most widowed women in Eleanor's position would have lost in the first month. He showed the letter to Eleanor. She read it twice, set it on the table, and was quiet for a moment. "I want to add 2 ranch hands," she said. "With the loan secure and the boundary settled, we can afford to grow the operation. Cal can't carry the load by himself, and I've been asking too much of him." "Agreed," Silas said. "I'll ask around." "Also," she said, and something shifted slightly in her tone, "I want to buy 10 more cattle before summer. There's a rancher in Layton who sells good stock. Pete Harlow mentioned him." "I'll go to Latin," Silas said, "if you tell me what you're looking for." She looked at him across the table. "I'll go with you," she said. "I know cattle better than you do." He held her gaze. "You're probably right about that." "I am right about that," she said, but she said it with something in her face that was almost soft, a warmth she didn't put on display often, which made it land harder when it showed up. Outside, the first real warm day of the year was gathering itself somewhere south and moving slowly in their direction, the way spring moved in Texas. Unhurried and unannounced until one morning you went outside and the air was different and the light was longer and the worst of it was behind you. They weren't finished. They weren't anywhere close to finished. There was still the debt to reduce, the herd to rebuild, the work of an operation trying to become something more than survival. There was still every ordinary difficulty of two people who had walked into an arrangement and found themselves somewhere more complicated than the arrangement had promised. But the boundary was settled. The banker was confident. The land was theirs, documented in ways that couldn't be picked apart by a patient man in a good coat who thought a widow was easier to take from than she turned out to be. Silas sat at the kitchen table after Eleanor had gone back out to the yard, and he looked at Gerald Pruitt's letter, and he thought about the word demonstrated again, and then he thought about October, the day he'd ridden up that dirt track expecting a day's wage, and walked away with the strangest agreement of his life. He thought about how different a thing had turned out to be from what either of them had reached for when they reached for it. He folded the letter and put it with the others in the wooden box under the desk in Thomas Whitlock's old office. His office now, he supposed, though he'd never thought of it that way. And he went outside to help Cal with the afternoon feeding, because the work was always there, and the work was what kept everything else standing. Spring came the way Eleanor had told him it always did in this part of Texas. Not gently, not gradually, but in a single decisive week where the temperature climbed 20 degrees, and the grass went from pale tan to something approaching green, and the light stretched itself out long and gold across the prairie, like it had been waiting to do exactly that all winter. Silas noticed it on a Tuesday morning when he walked out to the barn before sunrise, and the air didn't hit him cold the way it had every morning for 4 months. It was still cool, but it was the kind of cool that was retreating rather than advancing, and that was a different thing entirely. By the end of April, the ranch looked different from what it had been in October. 2 new hands, brothers named Emmett and Roy Slade, quiet men in their 30s who knew cattle and didn't require much managing, had come on in March and made an immediate difference in what could be accomplished in a working day. The fence lines were solid across all boundaries. The barn roof had been repaired properly, not patched. The water system worked without leaking. The equipment shed held tools that functioned, which was a small thing that turned out to matter significantly when you needed them. And the cattle. They'd gone to Layton in early April, Silas and Eleanor together, a full day's drive each way with a night at a boarding house in between. The rancher Pete Harlow had recommended was a broad-shouldered man named Santos, who ran clean stock and didn't inflate his prices for people he could see were buyers rather than browsers. Eleanor walked his pastures for 2 hours, while Silas stood back and watched her work. The way she moved through the herd, the specific things she looked at, the questions she asked Santos in a tone that was direct without being aggressive. She knew what she was looking for, and she found it. They came home with 11 cattle instead of 10, because Santos had thrown in a yearling heifer that Eleanor had looked at twice, and he'd caught her looking. "You want her," he'd said. "She's young," Eleanor said. "She's healthy, and her mother was one of the best producers I've had in 15 years. He named a price that was fair. "Take her." Eleanor had looked at Silas. He'd shrugged in a way that meant it was her call. She'd bought the heifer. On the drive back, the yearling tied behind the wagon, and making her feelings about travel known, Eleanor said, "You didn't try to talk me out of the extra one." "Why would I?" Silas said. "Thomas always wanted to think about it longer than necessary." "Thinking longer than necessary costs you the thing you're thinking about," Silas said. Santos wasn't going to hold her. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead. "You know, when I offered you this arrangement in October, I thought I was being practical. I told myself I was solving a legal problem. You were, Silas said. I was also, she said carefully, very lonely. I didn't admit that to myself until later. She said it the way she said most difficult things, flat and direct, without decorating it or apologizing for it. I want you to know that. I wasn't completely honest with you at the beginning, even if I didn't know it at the time. He drove for a while without responding. The wagon wheels turned. The yearling complained. I wasn't completely honest either, he said finally. She looked at him. I told you I was looking for honest work, he said. That was true, but I was also looking for a reason to stop. He kept his eyes on the road. 8 years of moving from place to place, I'd gotten tired of it. I just didn't have the language for that yet when I showed up at your gate. He paused. Your ranch gave me something to put my hands on that was worth the effort. That mattered before I knew anything else about you. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the road. That's the most I've heard you say about yourself in 6 months. Don't get used to it, he said. She smiled. It was the full one, not the brief, contained version she gave to most things, but the real one, the one that reached her eyes and made her look younger than the frontier had tried to make her. He saw it in his peripheral vision and didn't look directly at it, the way you don't look directly at certain things when you want them to last. The debt had been a living weight for so long that when it began to actually shrink, it took Eleanor a while to trust the numbers. Silas had taken over the ranch accounts in February, not because Eleanor asked him to, but because he'd found her at the desk at midnight 3 nights in a row, and he'd sat down beside her and looked at what she was working on and said, "Let me do this." She'd pushed back. He'd said, "You're better at the cattle. I'm better at this. We don't both need to be losing sleep over it." She'd pushed back again. He'd let her push. And then she'd gone to bed and he'd sat down at the desk and started going through the numbers. And in the morning, he had a revised payment schedule on the table that shaved 4 months off the projected payoff date. She'd looked at it. She'd looked at him. She hadn't said anything, but she also hadn't moved the papers. By the time May came around, they'd made 3 consecutive payments ahead of schedule, and the balance was something that looked like a real number rather than a wall. Gerald Pruitt sent a brief letter noting the consistent payments. Silas read it, put it in the wooden box, and went back to work. What he'd figured out, and what took him longer than it should have, because arithmetic wasn't the issue, was that the ranch had been bleeding money in small ways that added up to a significant wound. Feed purchased in quantities that didn't take advantage of bulk pricing. Equipment repaired repeatedly when replacement would have been cheaper in the long run. A payment schedule structured to minimize monthly amounts rather than total interest, which sounded helpful and wasn't. None of these were Thomas Whitlock's failures exactly. They were the decisions of a man managing a ranch who hadn't expected to stop being there to manage it. They were inherited problems, and inherited problems were just problems that felt older than they were. Silas fixed them one at a time, without ceremony. Emmett and Roy Slade turned out to be reliable in the specific way that mattered most. They showed up, they worked, they didn't cause trouble, and they asked the right questions when they didn't know something instead of improvising badly. Cal Hicks had turned 15 in March and was managing responsibilities that would have been given to a grown man anywhere else, and Silas had taken to paying him adult wages without making an announcement about it. Cal had noticed. He hadn't said anything, but Silas had seen the slight shift in how the boy carried himself after, the particular straightening of someone who's been told without words that their work is taken seriously. That was a thing Silas believed without having been taught it explicitly, that how you treated people doing good work either made them want to keep doing it or it didn't, and the cost of making them want to was usually less than the cost of losing them. It was Eleanor who named what had changed between them, because she was better at naming things than he was. It was a Sunday in late May, the kind of evening where the work was done and the light was going orange, and there was nothing urgent demanding attention for the first time in recent memory. They were on the porch, her in the chair that had been there since before Silas arrived, him leaning on the railing with a coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago. The prairie ran out to the west in a long, flat expanse that turned colors as the sun went down, and the cattle were visible as dark shapes in the far pasture, and somewhere close by a bird was doing something repetitive and unashamed about it. Eleanor said, "I don't need you to stay out of obligation." He looked at her. "The arrangement we made," she said. "It accomplished what it was supposed to. The bank is satisfied. The boundary is settled. The ranch is operating." She held his gaze steadily. "If you want to move on, that's something we could work out. I won't hold you to a paper." He looked at her for a long moment. "Is that what you want?" "I asked you first," she said. He turned back to the prairie and was quiet for long enough that she probably wondered what was coming. Then he said, "When I was 22, I worked a ranch outside San Antonio for 11 months. Longest I'd stayed anywhere. When I left, I packed everything I owned in about 15 minutes, rode out one morning, and didn't look back." He set the coffee cup on the railing. "I thought that was freedom, being able to leave without it costing you anything. And now?" she said quietly. "Now I know the reason it didn't cost anything was because I hadn't built anything worth leaving." He looked at her. "I've built something here. I'm not interested in walking away from it." Eleanor held his eyes for a moment. Something in her face worked through several expressions, none of which she tried to manage or conceal. Relief, and something more complicated that came after it. The look of a woman who'd been steeling herself for a specific kind of loss, and was working out what to do now that the loss hadn't arrived. "I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement a while ago," she said. "I don't know exactly when. Somewhere around the time you crossed the creek alone to get the cattle back, maybe. Or before that." She paused. "I want to say that plainly so there's no confusion about it later." "There's no confusion," he said. "Good." She looked back at the prairie. "Because I'm not easy to live with. I need you to know that going in properly." "Eleanor," he said, "I have opinions about nearly everything, and I don't let go of things quickly, and I—" "Eleanor," he said again. She stopped. "I've been living with you for 7 months," he said. "I'm aware of your opinions." She looked at him sharply, and then something broke loose in her expression. That real laugh again, the one she couldn't contain when it arrived. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was the kind of sound that changed the quality of the air around it. When it settled, she said, "I want this to be real. Not the legal version of real, actually real." "It already is," he said. "Has been for a while." She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the railing, and neither of them made more of it than that, because neither of them were people who needed to make more of things than they were. The hand was enough. The evening was enough. The prairie running out in front of them with the cattle in the far distance and the light going down slow was enough. There is something that gets missed in the stories people tell about the frontier, about the hard men and the hard land and the hardship that defined the era. What gets missed is how much of surviving it came down not to toughness in the solitary sense, but to the specific courage of choosing someone and building something with them that neither of you could have built alone. Silas Mercer had spent 8 years believing that belonging somewhere was a kind of trap, that the man who needed nothing and owned little and could leave any morning without consequence was the freest version of himself available. What he'd understood, slowly, through a winter that tried to break them, and a fight that required more patience than force, and 100 ordinary days of work done side by side, was that he'd had the definition exactly wrong. The trap wasn't belonging. The trap was the drifting. The trap was living in a way that protected you from loss by making sure you never had anything worth losing. Eleanor had needed a solution to a legal problem. That was true. But she'd also been a woman who had lost the person she'd built her life alongside, and who had kept going anyway, not because she was unaffected, but because the alternative was surrendering what that person had worked for. There was a kind of love in that, not the easy kind, the kind that costs something. Silas had shown up looking for wages. He'd found a purpose instead, which was harder to quantify and worth considerably more. By September, the herd had grown to 68 head, larger than it had been when Thomas Whitlock was alive. The debt was down to a number that had stopped keeping Eleanor awake at night, which she told Silas about in the matter-of-fact way she reported most things, and he'd noted it with the same quiet satisfaction he brought to most progress. Not celebration exactly, more like acknowledgement that the work was landing where it was supposed to. Cal Hicks had started asking questions in the evenings when the day's work was done, about herd management, about land records, about how you figured what a ranch was actually worth versus what the bank said it was worth. Silas answered him straight, without simplifying, and Eleanor added to the answers when she had something to add. The boy was going to be a good rancher. They both knew it, and neither of them said it out loud to him because he was 15 and praise too early had a way of replacing the hunger that drove good work. Pete Harlow came by in August with his eldest son and asked Silas's opinion on a boundary matter he was having with a neighbor to the north. Nothing as serious as what the Mercer Ranch had been through, but a disagreement about a fence line that had been drifting for years. Silas talked him through what he'd learned about survey documentation and what questions to ask the county clerk, and what it would cost to have Prudhomme walk the line if it came to that. Harlow listened and thanked him and said, on his way out, "You know, people in this county have started talking about this place differently than they used to." "How's that?" Silas asked. "Like it's one of the solid ones," Harlow said. "The kind that'll be here in 20 years. After Harlow left, Eleanor said, "Thomas would have liked hearing that." "Yes," Silas said. He thought about what to say next and found something honest. "I hope I'm building something he'd have respected." She looked at him with an expression that was direct and without sentiment in the manufactured sense, but not without feeling. "You are," she said. "You have been." The evening Silas thought about most, in the years that followed, was one from October, almost exactly a year from the day he'd ridden up the dirt track for the first time. There was nothing particular about it that made it memorable by event. The day's work was done. Emmett and Roy had gone home. Cal had ridden out an hour before. The ranch was quiet in the specific way it got in the fall when the day's heat had broken and the night hadn't fully arrived yet. They were on the porch, same positions as that May evening, more or less. The prairie going long and golden to the west, the cattle settled, the repaired fences running straight in both directions. Eleanor said, without preamble, "What were you thinking the day you rode in? Before I came out of the barn?" He thought about it honestly. That the place had good bones, he said. The land was solid. The livestock were healthy from a distance. The main house was tired, but not broken. He paused. "I thought whoever was running it was either on the edge of losing it or right on the edge of turning it around." "You couldn't tell which?" "Not until you opened your mouth," he said. "Then I could tell." She looked at him. "What did I say?" "You didn't say anything right away," he said. "You just told me to bring my horse to the water trough." He looked out at the prairie. "You thought about the horse before you thought about what you needed from me. That told me something." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "What did it tell you?" "That you were the kind of person who would actually take care of what you said you were going to take care of," he said. "That if you made an agreement, you'd keep it." He looked at her. "I was right." She held his gaze, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the evening settled around them the way evenings did when you were somewhere you actually wanted to be. "I was so frightened that morning," she said quietly. "When you rode up, I'd been thinking about what I was going to do for weeks. I'd run through the numbers every way I could, and there was no version of them that worked without some kind of help. And then you appeared on that road, and I thought, this is the only option I'm going to get. Don't ruin it." "You didn't ruin it," Silas said. "Neither did you," she said, which surprised me, honestly. "I'm aware," he said dryly. She smiled, and there it was, the full one, the real one, in the last of the evening light. Then she said more quietly, "I'm glad you didn't keep riding." He looked at her for a moment. "So am I," he said, "more than I know how to say." She reached over again the way she had that May evening, her hand over his on the railing, and they sat with the prairie running out to the west, and the light going down slow, and the cattle settled in the far grass, and the fences holding along every line. And it wasn't a perfect life. It was never going to be a perfect life, not in a country that took things without warning and asked more than it gave back on a regular basis. But it was theirs, and it was real, and that turned out to be the only thing either of them had ever actually needed it to be. Some people spend their whole lives looking for the place where they belong and never find it. Some find it and don't recognize it in time. And some, the lucky few, the ones who are also brave enough or stubborn enough or simply desperate enough to say yes to the right strange thing on the right unexpected morning, find it in the last place they thought to look. Silas Mercer had ridden up a dirt track looking for a day's wage. He'd found the rest of his life instead. And on that October evening, with Eleanor's hand over his and the Texas sky going dark above the land they'd fought for and kept, he thought that was about the best trade a man could ever make.